Welcome everyone to the series Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles, coming to you from the George Washington University in Washington, DC, Oxford University in Oxford, UK, and the United Nations in New York City. This is the third episode of the 2022 Spring or Hillary Term series, exploring the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI, and how it is being used in policy. I'm James Foster, the Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, representing the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP. I'm here with Jacob Dirksen and Ricardo Nogales of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, in the Department of International Development of Oxford University. And along with our colleagues at the Human Development Report at the UNDP, we're pleased to offer today's presentation, Profiling Gendered Multidimensional Poverty and Inequality in Post-Apartheid South Africa, presented today by Kehinde Omotoso of the University of South Africa, with discussion today by Jacob Assa of UNDP. In just a moment, I'll ask Ricardo to describe the series and introduce the speakers, but first, I'd like to express my appreciation to IIP's Executive Circle and its co-chairs Deborah Lair and Frank Wong for their continued support in making this series possible. And to the teams in OPHI and HDRO for lining up a great set of speakers for this term. Last week, Sam Jones of Copenhagen and UNU Wider proposed an alternative method of deciding who's poor in a multidimensional setting in his paper, Extending Multidimensional Poverty Identification from Additive Weights to Minimal Bundles, which I had the pleasure of discussing. Next week's episode will be a conversation with Adriana Stankiewicz-Serra of the University of Campinas and Inaki Permanya of the Center for Demographic Studies on multidimensional poverty in Brazil in the early 21st century, evidence from the demographic census. Please join us, or if not, you can always catch the reruns on the YouTube channel, IIEP GW, all one word. Now, without further ado, let me turn it over to Ricardo Nogales, who will introduce today's speakers and give a brief introduction. Ricardo.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to this third session for this very important seminar that we jointly organized between these three institutions. And just before presenting the speaker that we will have today and the wonderful discussant, let me just mention that the very essence of this series is to actually combine two things. Basically, we want to put forth from the highest academic standards, methodological discussions on how to measure and analyze multidimensional poverty or welfare in general. But also we want that discussion to actually transcend and be useful for the users, basically, which are in different realms, like, for example, policymaking, international organizations, and a lot of students. So our aim is very much to have a high-level discussion from the academic side, but also a useful one that could actually, link action and practice with academia. So without further ado, we have the honor of having Kehinde speaking today, and just let me very briefly introduce who she is. She's a PhD in economics from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and her research covers a wide range of development issues relating to multidimensional poverty, general development issues like health, gender, climate change, and food security. She has over a decade of experience analyzing the subjects from macro and microeconomic perspectives, and she has presented a lot of papers at conferences, international conferences, seminars, and workshops. She also has a very good number of very well-published journal articles on the subject, and she's currently doing a postdoctoral research fellowship. Her work will be discussed by one of the most prominent policy people and policy analysts at UNDP. Jacob Assa is the strategic advisor at the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa. He's been with the UN for over 22 years, studying as a statistician and then chief of section at DISA UNSD. He focused on macroeconomic aggregates and development indicators, and he was the chief editor of 3 flagship statistical publications at UNDP. He is now more recently working as an economist, focusing on least developed countries and the Human Development Report Office. He has extensive knowledge in not only methodological aspects of multidimensional poverty measurement, but also the policy relevance of such work. So I think we will have a very, very good session with the kind of speaker that we have and the quality of the discussants that we have for now. So without further ado, let me please give the mic to Kehinde to start this amazing session.
Okay, thank you so much, Jacob. Let me start by expressing my profound gratitude to Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, the Human Development Report Office, UNDP, and the Institute for International Economic Policy for the opportunity to present my paper. I'll be presenting the paper titled Profiling Gendered Multidimensional Poverty and Inequality in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Narrowing the gender gap. All efforts has been on narrowing gender gap in various aspects of life, and the top priority for South African policymakers. I would like to give a brief historical context before I go into my main motivation. South Africa history was permeated with discrimination based on race and gender, and women were mostly at the receiving end. Women were mostly inhabited the bastard towns, which were women were mostly unemployed for most of the year. Then women employment were largely domestic in nature, and very few economic opportunities were presented for women, and they largely depended on men for their livelihood. And there was a lot of poverty, a lot of inequality, and this resulted in a decline in marriages, increases in female-headed households, and female-related social issues. So post-apartheid, there have been a lot of policies and reforms to restructure, to transform, and to rebuild the economy post-apartheid. Emphasis has been on redressing the policies that permeated before the advent of democracy. So a lot of several reforms and policy were enacted, and these policies cover several areas such as health, education, social security, and unemployment. What I'm trying to drive at is that the problem was multidimensional in nature, and the solution and the approaches that were put together to tackle some of these challenges were equally National Health Plan for South Africa, which afforded nursing mothers, pregnant mothers, and children the opportunity to have free medical services, in housing conditions, clean water access, electrification, land reform, and public works to people, especially the previously disadvantaged population group. We have the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy, and the accelerated and shared growth initiative for South Africa. We also have a new growth path. All these policies and reforms were targeted at reducing poverty, and most of the focus was on women, because like I've stated earlier, women were the receiving hands during those periods of the apartheid. So post-apartheid, all efforts were put together to make sure that gender discrimination, gender inequality, and gender poverty were alleviated as much as possible. So there were so many policies from different angles that were enacted to tackle that. But what does the empirical evidence shows us? Empirical evidence shows that much emphasis has been on gender income poverty. That is, analysis have been more on analyzing poverty from an aggregate level and from the income angle. And we all know that poverty is not just about lack of income or lack of money to meet basic necessities. People do go through multiple deprivations, and this affects their access to social services, access to healthcare, education. People are not just poor because they don't have access to money, but because they don't have access to key factors like education, like healthcare, like housing, and all of that. And most of the studies in the literature find that female-headed households are particularly vulnerable to income poverty because the emphasis has been on income poverty. Other studies also find that, like Rogan in 2016 finds a slight widening in income poverty differential between male-headed and female-headed households. And the reductions in gender differentials in burial capacity are quite far from desired levels. You know, there have been narrowing. I'm not arguing that there have not been a reduction in gender poverty or inequality, but literature makes us to understand that these reductions are quite far from the desired levels that we would have loved to see. For instance, women still earn significantly less than men in terms of salaries, hourly wages, high-paying jobs, and lifetime income earnings. And women on many fronts, they are still subject to poverty and are more likely to suffer deprivations in many dimensions. So based on this, I'll be exploring gender multidimensional poverty in the post-apartheid period while taking a broader view of the experiences of multiple deprivation that individuals suffer and households also suffer. And this has the implication for poverty reduction policies and interventions in South Africa. So the main objective is just to look at, just like the title, is to profile, multidimensional poverty for both men and women, and to see how much of a narrowing or reduction has taken place in gender poverty, multidimensional poverty. Okay, having said that, the policy relevance of this work is just to provide a basis for measuring the impact or otherwise of policy aimed at reducing gender gaps in poverty. Like I've said earlier, a lot of efforts, a lot of policies, reforms, and programs and activities have gone into reducing gender poverty in South Africa. So this can provide, what I've done in this paper, can provide a basis for measuring analysis of the impact of a specific policy or an intervention to see how it has reduced gender inequality or gender poverty in South Africa. Then this can also help to assess whether gender-focused and friendly poverty alleviation strategies have reduced poverty uniformly, or are there some areas that we still need to really improve? Some areas doing good, or if they are doing good, what more can the government or relevant stakeholders do in order to further improve gender equality? Then if South Africa is to make progress towards the gender-related sustainable development goals, then deficiencies in SDG-related indicators need to be identified for further policy intervention. This is very important. Very soon now, we'll be doing the assessment of the overall evaluation of the 2030 targets of the SDGs. And it's very important that this type of analysis take place so that we'll be able to see area of method that we'll be using is based on a multidimensional methodology developed by Alkire-Foster. And the method was applied to the 2018. It's a repeated cross-sectional survey, and it has a national representative The sample includes approximately up to multi-stage stratified results and individuals. And more importantly, this survey collects a wide range of demographic and socioeconomic information and information on well-being and standard of living, which are critical to this type of analysis. You know, questions on housing, on education, on healthcare, on indicators that are very relevant in this analysis. Why it should stop this method? This method is a widely acknowledged one. You would agree with me. The Alkire-Foster multidimensional methodology is widely acknowledged and used by researchers because it expresses the joint distribution of deprivations, of multiple deprivations. And I mean, it can be modified by users. It's user-friendly. And it takes into consideration multiple forms of deprivation experienced by poor individuals at any given point in time, which is critical to analyzing poverty. Like I've said, it's not just about lack of income. This is about multiple deprivations that people go through, people experience daily in terms of access to basic social services and all that. Then it involves counting the number of deprivation each individual simultaneously experiences across multiple dimensions of well-being. In order to execute this method, we have to follow 9 steps, which I've listed here. Some of us are quite familiar with this. I will not talk much about this. We have to define our set of indicators. We have to set the deprivation cutoff for each indicator. We have to apply the cutoffs to ascertain whether each person is actually deprived or not in each of the indicator. We have to select the relative weight for each indicator. We have to create the weighted proportion of deprivation for each person. After then, we can determine the poverty cutoff. We have the conventional poverty cutoff of 1/3 of the weighted indicators. Then we have to compute the proportion of people who have been identified to be multidimensionally poor. Then we compute the intensity of poverty, and we compute the measure of the product of the 2 previous indices, which will give us the adjusted head count. Yeah. For this study, the units of analysis were limited to adults between the ages of age 18 years and beyond. Those are above 18 years. That was a unit of analysis. We used 12 indicators across 4 dimensions: health, education, economic activity, and living condition. The 4 dimensions are equally weighted, and similarly, the indicators within each dimension are equally weighted. For simplicity, there are 2 steps to computing the MPI. I wouldn't want to go too much into the details of the theoretical framework of this because of our time, but there are 2 key steps to computing the MPI, which we did, which involves the identification and aggregation. The identification step just determines which individuals are multidimensionally poor, while the final aggregation step involves generating a set of 3 poverty measures, which are very important in any analysis of multidimensional poverty. The incidence of poverty, the intensity of poverty, and the MPI. And the combination of the 2 gives us the MPI. This is the figure you are looking at here is the structure of a typical MPI. That's the structure generally of a conventional MPI. We have the 10 indicators. We have the 3 dimensions. But in our own case, like I told you, we try to adapt the methodology to suit the realities in South Africa. So we have 4 dimensions and we have 12 indicators. The dimension that we included is economic inactivity, and the indicator under this is unemployment. Yeah, we would want to ask, why is unemployment having that kind of weight? In South Africa, unemployment is a big social issue, and it's in fact recently the unemployment rate has risen dramatically given the incidence of COVID-19 and a lot of factors associated with COVID-19. So unemployment is a key issue that is very critical in South Africa because of its low rate among especially the youth. So we included it as a standalone dimension in this particular study, and we included other dimensions, which included under health we have illness and chronic diseases. Under education we have school attendance and years of schooling. Under living conditions we have those 8 sets of indicators, which included electricity, water, sanitation, and all that. So these are the social, what you are looking at currently are the social indicators and the deprivation cutoffs. Then a person is some of the theoretical framework that are provided here. So from the major results, what we got for our finding is that for raw headcount ratio for the MPI indicators, unemployment and presence of chronic illnesses are key in gendered multidimensional poverty. If we look at this table very well, you will see that for women, it's like 47.1% of women compared to 40.2% of men, are deprived in chronic disease indicator. That is, they live in an household where one or more members are chronically ill. So the issue of chronic illness is a big issue in South Africa. We call it the triple burden of disease, where the diabetes and all those associated chronic diseases, cancer and all of that is a big issue in household, and it affects sources of income. People that are sick cannot go out to work. People that are sick have to use most of their money to pay for healthcare services and all of that. And that could be a factor that leads to poverty when people do not have access to enough income, to enough money to eat. They have to use all the little resources they have to treat themselves because they are having one chronic disease or the other. Another big issue is unemployment. Currently, women are disfavored in this regard. 28.5% of women, are unemployed or live in a household. Let me put it that way: live in a household that's one adult member or two are not working. That's a big issue. For men, what they discover is that school attendance, years of schooling, is lower for women, but school attendance is in favor of men. That we have more men attending school, more women attending schools more than men. Then for electricity, water, sanitation, it varies across men and women. But I think the key thing that we can pick from this table is that unemployment and the presence of chronic illnesses are key for women in terms of multidimensional poverty there. We have more women being deprived in these indicators than men. Then I also looked at the gender differential in multidimensional poverty, looking at the 3 measures that are previously discussed. We see that we see this consistency in women experiencing multidimensional poverty more than their male counterparts. In fact, about 17% of women are multidimensionally poor when compared to their male counterpart, which is about 16%. There's still that marginal increase in the percentage of women that are poor, multidimensional poorer than men. In fact, the figure is higher for women than for the total population put together. Although the intensity of poverty remains the same for both men and women. And for the adjusted headcount ratio, otherwise known as the MPI, we see the same thing, that poverty is more prevalent among women than men. And as in 2018, this shows that there is still this gender gap in poverty, which is to the disfavor of women. That is, more women are multidimensionally poorer than their male counterparts. Yeah. And in terms of multidimensionally poorer, with the figure of the MPI. Then we also proceeded in furtherance of the objective of the paper. We also calculated the MPI within a range of cutoffs for men and women. We wanted to see, how women or men vulnerable to poverty, how do they fare in terms of poverty, and in terms of chronic poverty. At cutoff above 50, around 45 to 50, let's say, that is the measure for chronic poverty. What is so interesting about this figure is that at cutoff between 25 to 33.3, which is our poverty, which is a multidimensional poverty cutoff, that I mean 33.3. If we look at it, it's so obvious that women are still multidimensionally poorer, vulnerable to poverty. I won't say poorer now. I'll call them the precarious non-poor. They are non-poor in some sense, but women are still vulnerable, are more vulnerable to poverty than men. We see the gap, that we see the gap out, towards the latter end for those who are chronically or severely poor. If we look at 45 to 50, we see that it's as if there are as many men and women that are chronically poor in 2018. And what it shows us is that maybe we can imply, or one can infer, that maybe some government or some efforts in reducing chronic poverty among men and women, have been fantastic, because here we see a reduction, a drastic reduction, and we see that there are the gaps, the gender gaps, they are so much narrowed that, it's as if there is no gender gap in that area when compared to those who are actually poor or those who are vulnerable to poverty. So we still see that women are still poorer. So interventions or gently policies that can improve women's empowerment, women's access to basic services, women's education, healthcare services should be encouraged, should be fostered, so that the gap can still, reduce further. Then we segregated our headcount by dimension for both men and women. What we discover is that economic activity makes the highest contribution. Economic activity, dimensional, makes the highest contribution to multidimensional poverty, and is slightly higher for women than for men. This is followed by health, where we see a significant difference for men and women there. If you look at that figure very well, although the highest contribution is from economic activity, but when we see a major difference, actually in terms of for men and women, we see the in health and living conditions. So economic activity and health play a major role in dimensions, play a major role, key contributors to multidimensional poverty, and is higher for women than for men. Then in terms of the contribution of our indicators for women, we try to break it down, because if you look at the dimension is, have a lot of indicators as subsumed there. So we try to look at the indicator, the issue of the indicators. What we discover is unemployment played a key role, and is slightly, I'm not surprised, of course, because unemployment is a key indicator for our economic inactivity, and it was higher for women than for men. And but in terms of health, we see here that the chronic illness, that is for those who are chronically ill or live in household that people are chronically ill, we see there making much contribution for gender differences in multidimensional poverty. Like I told you before, in South Africa, we have this triple burden of disease, quadruple a burden of disease, in terms of people having to suffer chronic diseases such as diabetes, such as cancer, and all of that. And this has a toll on income, on household income or personal income, and this, in one way or the other, have a way of filtering into making the household poorer. And this shows that it affects more women than men. So key findings shows that government and non-relevant stakeholders need to direct more effort towards improving health and employment opportunities for women in order to further narrow gender gap in multidimensional poverty. Government is already doing a lot with the collaboration of non-state actors, but they can do more in order to reduce, narrow the gap, the gender gap in multidimensional poverty. Because from our analysis, it shows clearly that these two key areas are germane to narrowing gender poverty in South Africa. Improving access to jobs for women, especially for women, for all, especially for women, and then improving healthcare access, improving maybe awareness on healthy lifestyle and all of that will reduce incidence and prevalence of chronic disease in the society. That's very important. So in conclusion, there's a need to foster the right combination of policies. We are talking of employment. So there is a need to combine the right policies and intervention that will facilitate generation of decent jobs, not just any job, decent jobs, transition from one learning apprenticeship to decent jobs and all of that, healthy lifestyle, and increased access to healthcare for the vulnerable and poor women. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kehinde. That was wonderful. Really appreciate your explanation. That was so quick, and apart from technical problems, was absolutely clear. Let's now turn it over to Jacob. Go ahead, Jacob Assa, for discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Foster, and thank you for the excellent presentation. I will now share my screen. Okay, good. Before I start, I would like to say that I feel very privileged to be here as part of this discussion, not just because of the collaboration with OPHI and being in the company of Professor Foster, but also because this paper gave me a very rich insight into a national level analysis of multidimensional poverty. Before this point, I've only seen the global picture. I worked a little bit on the global MPI report in HDRO. And at the beginning of my career, I was a statistician. So we did some work on the Millennium Development Goals, which had simpler indicators of poverty. So it's really nice to see the progression over years. And I'll start with that, what poverty means in the recent history of the UN system. And I don't know if you know, I didn't know that until recently, but there were 3 UN decades for the eradication of poverty, one from 97 to 2006, and that more or less overlaps with the period of the Millennium Development Goals. The MDGs had 3 indicators related to poverty. The initial one was income poverty, less than 125 a day, later updated to 190. Poverty gap ratio, which measured how many or how far below the poverty line people were. And third one, share of the poorest quintile in national consumption. The second decade for the eradication of poverty coincided with the SDGs. And here we already see some progress in terms of the depth and breadth of measurement. You had a disaggregation by sex, you had national poverty lines and not just global poverty lines. And the third indicator is actually the national MPI already, poverty in all its dimensions. Right now, in 2022, we are in the middle of the 3rd UN decade for the eradication of poverty, which aims to accelerate global actions for a world without poverty. And part of these actions can be seen in the global MPI report that focused on ethnicity and gender, and in the paper we're discussing today on a national perspective. Just a few quick facts from the global report to put this in context. 2/3 of all people who are multidimensional poor live in households where girls or women, no girls or women completed at least 6 years of schooling. So this is really, really dramatic. In 14 countries, female-headed households are poorer using the MPI than male-headed households. And the incidence of multidimensional poverty in male-headed households is positively correlated with increasing violence against women and girls. So these are not just statistics, this is people's lives, and it's very important. Now, one of the greatest contributions of the paper presented today for me is to emphasize how much more information we get from a multidimensional perspective than out of monetary poverty. Now, the paper does acknowledge, and I agree, that these are complementary measures. We're not aiming to replace income poverty. But in addition to being wider, the MPI gives a different picture. And in 43 of the 60 countries that have both measures, the incidence of multidimensional poverty was higher than monetary or income poverty. And here is a context from Africa. Now, just a word of advice, this is using the global data, not the national data, so it might be different than in the paper. But some of the countries, like Sao Tome, Togo, Malawi, have much higher income poverty than multidimensional. And other countries have it the other way around, especially Mauritania. If you look at Mauritania, income poverty headcount is about 5%, and multidimensional poverty headcount is 50%. That's quite a large difference. And the same applies in Ethiopia and Guinea. So the basic story is already different. This is another chart from the global report. You can see that Africa is not the worst placed. In Africa, 65.9% of people are multidimensionally poor who live in households with no girls or women who are educated. This is lower than the Arab states and South Asia. Now, zooming into this paper, I think one of the key effects that it provides us is to demonstrate what can be done. In addition to having more dimensions than income, it can be further tailored to local context, history, and political economy. So instead of the usual 3 dimensions, health, education, and standard of living, this paper has 4, the 4th one being economic activity. And it has 12 indicators instead of 10. 2 new ones, food security added to the standard of living, unemployment added to economic activity, but also a customization of the other dimensions. So in health, instead of nutrition and child mortality, ill health or chronic health and disease were added in place of those 2 standard ones. So this makes it much more relevant for the specific focus of South African political economy. And this is related to the policies that were mentioned in the presentation, the Reconstruction and Development Program, Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, National Health Plan, and Employment Equity. Now, the addition of the unemployment indicator sounded intuitively correct to me, but then I checked. This is data from the ILO. These are national estimates provided to the ILO by country, so it's not model data, but indeed, unemployment is the highest in the sample of countries in Africa, higher for females than males. But in a country like Seychelles or Senegal, other indicators might be more relevant. So the choice of unemployment is indeed appropriate. The methodology was already discussed. I will not repeat that. But to me, some of the key findings that were really shocking is that almost half of women who are multidimensionally poor live in households where at least one member has chronic disease. This is half the population almost, or half the women who live in that circumstance. And almost a third live in households where at least one member is unemployed. In both cases, women suffer more than men from these deprivations. But also interesting is that men have their own areas of excessive deprivation: housing, schooling years, electricity. The intensity was the same. So overall, the head count is greater than the depth, and the sex poverty is greater than 1, sex poverty ratio. Now, I compare this to the Gender Development Index published by HDRO, which is simply the Female Human Development Index divided by the male. And this actually confirms the results in the paper, because a GDI of less than 1 shows that female human development is lower than male human development, which makes sense if more women are poor than men. The only difference was in the details, as always, because men in the Gender Development Index did better than women in years of schooling, and obviously in income, where the income is almost double. Whereas in the MPI presented today, I think men did worse in schooling. So that's the nuances you get with different measures. Also, a key finding of this paper is that the poverty gender gap narrows as poverty threshold increased, and I'll say a bit more about that later. But moving from data to policy, I think when we talk about the MPI, it's not just a statistical achievement, it's also a policy achievement. Because if you only look at South Africa using poverty gap in terms of income, policies are rather limited. You want to increase women's wages, you want to maybe provide a few more marginal solutions. But if you have an analysis that is multidimensional, your toolkit as a policymaker becomes huge. As was mentioned, policies recommended based on this analysis, including reducing the gender gap in employment, directing efforts to improving women's health, programs to strengthen women's entrepreneurial skills, helping women to transition smoothly from internships to decent jobs, and counseling on health, financial issues. So there's so much more we can do if our analysis is broader. And this can all be done not just by the state, but in partnership with the private sector and NGOs. So I will conclude with 3 questions, both about the paper and about further research. Some of them may be outside the scope of the paper, but I thought we can just openly discuss this. One question that I saw also in the global report is that women and men lead in a negative way in different areas. So women have higher deprivations and unemployment and chronic illness, but men, both in South Africa and many other countries, in schooling, electricity, all the other standard of living. So why? I was really curious to see that. I haven't read an explanation about that. And the reason I think it's useful to dig into that is because while we do have more policies available with the MPI, we can design them better and in a more targeted manner if we knew what the structural cause was. If it's a labor market deficiency, if it's a political problem, and so forth. So if we can get more insight into that, that would be very, very helpful. And the fact that the gender gap in multidimensional poverty narrows as the poverty threshold is increased is good news potentially. It's almost zero, it's severe poverty. But I'm wondering, I didn't see that in the paper, if this is indeed a result of policies. That would be great. But theoretically, it could be the result of more women moving into severe poverty, equaling the level of men. So it would be great to have a bit more information on that to indeed verify if it's a result of policy. And the third question is a bit more forward-looking. I recently did some work on socioeconomic responses to COVID. And what we found in Africa is that Africa was less affected directly by the virus. There's less cases and deaths per capita or per million than, let's say, South America or definitely OECD countries. But the indirect impacts were worse because Africa experienced decreased employment and income, increased poverty. So the fact that the 2 biggest dimensions that you outlined in the paper were unemployment and chronic disease made me wonder, does multidimensional poverty make a country more vulnerable to external shocks? And whether the gender gap also contributes to such vulnerability. Anyway, this has been a real pleasure and it opened up a lot of questions and I look forward to a discussion. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Jacob. And indeed, we've been receiving some Q&A in the Q&A response function. So please go ahead and put your questions there anytime, any moment they come to you. I just want to turn it back over, if I could, for just a second. I'm wondering whether Kehinde can hear us and if she could respond to the discussant first.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Jacob. I quite appreciate your comments and the discussions. For some of them, you discovered that for females or for males, okay, we talked about years of schooling and all of that. But you discovered that it's not just about the years of schooling, there's also the school attendance, which is higher, I think, for females than for males. Then it's just for the chronic disease, okay, the issue of COVID-19. You would agree with me that COVID-19, South Africa was hardly hit with COVID-19 than when compared with other African countries like Nigeria or Senegal or Tanzania. So that could partly explain what this analysis, what our findings, could partly explain why the issue of people currently, we're still experiencing that, the issue of the impact of COVID-19 on jobs, on health, and the death rate was higher in South Africa than in some similar countries. I mean, like than in other even developed countries. So this also points to the fact that the issue of chronic illness, the issue of unemployment, are big determinants of multidimensional poverty between men and women. We saw the gender differences. Statistics are available to that effect. So that is one point that I can raise, that I can recollect now. I will respond as I think through other points. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I had actually a question, but since Sophie is also in the Q&A, has started it off, why don't I go ahead and ask her a question. The first one is, hi, thanks very much for this presentation. Very interesting. Can I ask you why you used the 2018 GHS rather than the NIDS panel data, which goes from 2008 to 2017?
Thank
The
you
trend
so
analysis.
much.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I've gone through it. I have another paper that look at the trends, because I mean it's quite interesting. You begin to see how people go, how people move out of vulnerability to poverty, then how people move out of poverty, and then how people go. You know, the transition matrix is very interesting. So I have another paper to that effect, and I just did this paper as one of the key analysis, because if you look at the GHS data, the GHS data is more robust in terms of sample size than the panel data. That needs data. It's a panel data, right? But we have large samples there where we can really explore and see the sample representation for both of them are good, but in terms of the sample size, the GHS data is quite interesting, and more interesting, so to say, than the NIDS data, the NIST data, so to say. So I also have another analysis that I've used that I can share with very quite interesting results too. I've done the analysis for each of them, and I have it too. So this one, you know, is a research. So I've done that one and I did this one, and I mean, they speak to each other. I mean, the findings. So I quite appreciate that question. So I've done analysis in that regard. Thank you.
Great. So actually, Sophie continues on with what I think is a very salient question concerning individual versus group-based data. And I want to just link that back to what Jacob was saying, that MPI is a great toolkit for policymakers. When everything is done at the household level, so it isn't individual level, isn't it true that it's less effective, if you will, as a kind of targeting or an understanding of the types of policies that are needed? For instance, when you have household level data concerning unemployment, you really don't know where the unemployment or among who it's coming from. Likewise with health. And one of the things I'm not sure, did you separate out at an individual level the individualized health data, or did you keep them at the household level? And so if you could clarify that and answer the question that Sophie has put forward, why did you choose household rather than individual level MPI?
Thank you so much for that question. You would agree with me that it's quite difficult to get questions or variables or indicators at the individual level. You know, in most of our household surveys, most of these surveys are household surveys, and sometimes these are quite beyond us, beyond, I mean, the researchers, because these questions are, these surveys are secondary data sources. Unless I'm open to carrying out, because I've explored a lot of, even if you look at the NIDS data, you see a lot of questions at the household level too. So I'm open to like an opportunity that would afford me to do some individual level analysis, like maybe collect individual level data. I know those can be quite expensive and all of that. So, and I still want to believe in Africa. doing analysis at the household level is not totally out of context, because given our structure, given our family structure and our culture and all of that, if you look at our situation, our peculiarities, sometimes household information do reflect in some of we can use household level in this type of analysis and we still get something reasonable out of it. I'm not saying we should not go out and look at the individual level, but I think in the context of Africa, just a bit of justification is not totally out of order or out of context to use household level information or data if that is what is available to use. You know, these things are just beyond the researchers sometimes because they do not collect this data themselves. They have the data fees there, so they have to make use with what they have. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And I did want to just clarify something, because in your table, everything seems to be household when you're talking about indicators and cutoffs, but except for the health variables, which say explicitly ill health is ill and could not seek medical care due to inability to pay, and chronic disease is chronically ill. So my question once again is this individual in those two indicators, or is that just wrong in the table?
Okay, thank you. I think what is there is a member of an household, at least one member of the household is sick and could not afford to go to the hospital or seek medical care. I mean, it's chronically ill, maybe having some kind of like diabetes or so, and could not afford access to healthcare services because they do not have financial resources. I think that should be at the household level, not at the individual level.
Okay, that'll clarify things quite a bit, because when I started seeing the discussion, which had a kind of issue saying that women are in worse health situations than men, of course, this flies in the face of every bit of data on mortality and all kinds of results that are out there. Also, there's the interesting self-reported aspect that women versus men tend to be self-rating worse health in the short run and with during their lives, and yet they tend to live longer. So it's quite an interesting contradiction in the health data typically. So I just wanted to clarify that. Quite interesting. Thank you so much for that. We did have a question from Samuel. I'm not sure if it's been answered or not, but it was said, thank you for the presentation. Could you speak a bit about the choice of indicators, weights, and cutoffs for your index, and whether you did any robustness tests? Just a little bit of discussion about that.
Like I've said, this is just one of my papers on the multidimensional poverty. So I kept it so simple because I'm just like exploring, you know, exploring the gendered multidimensional poverty at this stage. So what I did was just to use the equal weighting structure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm quite familiar now that there are a lot of papers, a lot of authors that have come up with these different weighting structures where you allocate weight based on some kind of measures. But I didn't go that route. I used just the simple equal weighting structure, and I did a kind of robustness check by checking through the provinces in South Africa and to see the consistency of results, whether we still have, you know, male or female, I mean female now, being more multidimensionally poorer in this province than the other. And in some of the provinces, I think most of the provinces, I think all of them, I'm not quite sure because I didn't include it there. I think the result was robust to the measures that I calculated, the MPI measures of the male and female poverty measure. I think it was fine. Yeah, that was the robustness check that I did for this particular paper. Just to be sure that the analysis is consistent across the provinces. If we are saying female are more likely to be poorer, multidimensionally poorer, they poorer maybe in Gauteng compared to Western Cape, in Eastern Cape, across those provinces. And that was what I did exactly. Thank you.
Great. Well, I did have one additional question, which was concerning your final result that women are more vulnerable to poverty than men. Of course, with the data being pooled per household, it's hard to see that. It's actually women are more likely to be in households where there's poverty than men. But what do you think would happen if you could get into the specifics and gendered data? What is your prior on that? That if we had available data that was gendered in key dimensions, would it be more or would it be less the gender gap, if you will, here in poverty that you found?
Absolutely. I mean, it would be quite interesting to be able to explore, do this kind of analysis using a purely individual level gender data. I think we're going to see, it's going to be more obvious. I mean, so clear, the difference we're talking about, because here now we are lumping out the issue of the household level. I think we're going to get more interesting results. I mean, it's not going to be totally different from this, but we're going to see it more clearly, like, wow, this is what was lumped up here, and now we can see it it's more precise than what we have using the household level. So I'm really, in fact, I would be very interested to have access to such type of data, to work with like minds on analyzing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I did have one question I just wanted to ask Jacob, if he could. Could you expound a little bit more, just taking what you've read? Do you have, I want to give you a little bit more chance to think about policy implications of this and the results that you read. Could you get in a little bit more deeply in the weeds for us, or if not, more generally in terms of other studies as well? But I was hoping in this study, if you could, just talk a little bit more deeply about poverty, policy, I mean, in this area.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Go ahead, Kehinde.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask Jacob first and then finish with you, Kehinde.
Okay, so I've worn different hats throughout my career. First, I was a statistician, then economist, now strategic advisor. And I think you look at different things differently depending on what your job is. So when it comes to policy, what I've discovered is it's often hard to jump from data analysis like this paper directly to policy. What is sometimes missing is a causal model. So what I would suggest, before we can go into more detail about what policies are needed, we need to model what's going on. So for example, why does the gap between women and women become narrower at severe poverty levels? What is causing that? Why are men more likely to be in deprived households with regards to years of schooling or assets, and women in chronic health? So the why is important, because it's one thing to see a deprivation, and obviously you can put resources towards that, but there's a risk in a world with limited government resources and also private resources that you would divide your assets or your money in so many baskets that you wouldn't achieve anything useful. So the next step for me would be to do some kind of economic or econometric analysis to see what is driving what. Is there a problem with the South African labor market? Is there discrimination issue at offices or companies? Is there a problem with the South African health system? Not just the insurance, but the hospitals, the doctor training. And if we could get a more direct analysis of the causes of these results, because the results are very valuable, but we don't know why they are, then policy would be able to be crafted in a more targeted way and make your money go an extra mile. That's what I would say at this point.
Fantastic. Kehinde, you were just jumping in. You can jump in right now, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Jacob. This type of analysis, like I've stated earlier, provides basis for a kind of cost-effect analysis of, okay, why, of the why questions, and trying to look at the cause and the effect of, the cause effect analysis, basically. So it's quite interesting. We found some interesting results that we can take it further, look at specific interventions or specific policies. Okay, there have been a lot of policies to tackle or reduce the incidence and prevalence of chronic diseases among men and women. Why is it that, they're not working for maybe mostly women? But just like the questions of severe poverty that Jacob also has can be explored through that means. But we need to combine the right policies together in order to push forward. But that will be based on a cause effect analysis. Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you, Jacob. I will make one more comment before we bring today's session to a close, and that's by Corinne Mitchell, who is saying that, on the topic of COVID vulnerability, Statistics South Africa has developed a COVID-19 Vulnerability Index, SACVI, using the census and the AF method, which helped inform vaccination rollout and might also be of interest. And it's given in the Q&A. I'm not sure who can see that, but in any case, it's given in the Q&A. If you don't see it there, you can always just put in your Google South African COVID-19 Vulnerability Index. All right, well, I see no more questions, and therefore I'm going to bring it to a close. I want to thank all the participants today. If you're able to, I look forward to seeing you next week, all the people who have participated. Until then, take care, adios, goodbye, no matter where you are.